They had been seized thousands of miles distant from their residences, extracted from combat zones in North Africa, France, or Italy, and conveyed across the Atlantic Ocean in heavily guarded naval groups. The captured German soldiers anticipated severe treatment from America. Nazi information campaigns had led them to expect deprivation, restraints, and unending degradation inflicted by their adversaries. However, when the transports ultimately disembarked them in locations such as Texas, Nebraska, or Iowa, they encountered a scenario that bore no resemblance to their expectations. The camps were structured, nearly antiseptic when compared to the squalor of the war zones, and instead of sinking into grime or particles, the living quarters were constructed with tidy lumber boards, protected windows, and durable sleeping platforms. The initial perception for numerous German prisoners of war was that their captors appeared resolute in not physically harming them, but in containing them with relative respect. Meals were handed out with punctual precision. Dishes contained flesh, bread, greens, and even the occasional sweet treat. A considerably larger quantity of sustenance than German citizens were obtaining concurrently back in their homeland. Coffee, a commodity scarce and treasured in wartime Europe, was offered practically daily, and the sheer plentifulness of sugar left them speechless. It was not an ideal situation, naturally. Thorny barriers stood imposingly, watch posts were situated at each angle, and automatic firearms tracked every movement. But in contrast to what numerous individuals had dreaded, the divergence was nearly bewildering. The aspect that impressed the prisoners most in those initial days was the sensation of regularity. Name verifications occurred at daybreak, but subsequently, existence stabilized into a cadence that incorporated labor assignments, athletic activities, and even accessibility to literary works. They were presented with chances to study the English language, engage in academic sessions, or even peruse American journals under observation. Some individuals mocked this initially, rejecting it as propaganda. Nevertheless, the mere actuality that such opportunities were available instigated the preliminary uncertainties concerning their foe. They commenced perceiving that their captors were not exclusively focused on retribution, but on governance, stability, and perhaps shockingly, on cultural sway. Nonetheless, none of them were equipped for the subsequent occurrence. During the hours of darkness, within the security of their sleeping areas, murmurs circulated throughout the quarters concerning unverified reports. Adjacent American settlements desired to dispatch performers, vocal ensembles, even women to amuse the detainees. The mere notion appeared preposterous, bordering on offensive. Why would America squander its time conveying concerts into thorny barrier-surrounded compounds? Numerous prisoners of war dismissed it entirely, considering it another manipulative strategy, something they had overheard fleetingly from watchmen attempting to sow uncertainty. But the unverified reports expanded, and expectancy intensified. For the present, however, the prisoners acclimated to existence in confinement. They participated in soccer matches on dusty terrains demarcated with makeshift goals, mended agricultural apparatus during labor assignments, and composed assessed correspondence destined for their residences. Each passing day, they scrutinized the horizon for any indication of something atypical, any disruption in the repetitiveness of camp existence. And although the watchmen upheld order with control, there was no disputing that American detention had not shattered their resolve. It unsettled their minds in an unexpected way. It deviated greatly from their preconceived notions. Its level of civilization was remarkably high, and amidst that perplexing space between trepidation and authenticity, the groundwork was being prepared for the astonishment that would genuinely render them speechless. The introduction of American women into the confines of the camps. The circulating rumors within the camps rapidly materialized into confirmed reality. One afternoon during the summer, announcements were posted on the bulletin boards inside the enclosed areas. A unique program would be presented, arranged through collaboration between a nearby women's association, the U.S. Army, and the USO. Initially, the detainees mocked the notion, certain that it represented some form of cruel jest. But as they observed wooden seating being transported into the recreation area, along with a rudimentary stage constructed from wooden planks, disbelief transitioned into curiosity. Why would Americans, amidst a global conflict, dispatch civilians, particularly women, into the very core of a prisoner of war camp? The initiative frequently stemmed from communities residing near the camps. Churches, women's organizations, and patriotic societies volunteered their services to provide concerts, theatrical performances, and lectures for the incarcerated individuals. For numerous Americans, it offered an opportunity to showcase their cultural dominance, demonstrating that their nation waged war not only with weaponry, but also with philosophies, melodies, and empathy. Certain individuals simply sought to alleviate boredom within the camps, under the belief that keeping the prisoners occupied would mitigate potential unrest. For others, especially religious groups, it stood as an embodiment of Christian obligation to extend a degree of benevolence even to adversaries. However, for the German soldiers, this anticipation defied comprehension. The majority had been consistently exposed to portrayals of America as corrupt, perilous, and intensely antagonistic. Yet the prospect of American women willingly venturing into an enclosure teeming with captured enemy combatants contradicted everything they had been indoctrinated to believe. In Germany, women were strictly isolated from foreign prisoners, and any hint of cultural interaction with captives would have been denounced. Learning that American women would perform musical pieces, recite poetic verses, or simply converse with them felt surreal, resembling a fantasy conceived in captivity. On the day of the initial performance, the guards implemented heightened security protocols. Marksmen positioned themselves at each corner, and soldiers maintained surveillance as the women arrived in vehicles. The prisoners, pressed against the perimeter fence, descended into astonished silence. They anticipated stern-faced authorities, but instead encountered young women in summery attire, carrying musical scores and instruments. Certain individuals sported elegantly angled hats, while others held hymnals. Their very presence radiated an electrifying aura. For individuals who had endured months or even years, devoid of female companionship, the mere sight of them was overwhelming. Conversations ceased abruptly, supplanted by a stillness so pervasive that it felt as though the entire camp held its collective breath. One prisoner later reflected upon that instant in his journal, recounting how the aroma of perfume and the sound of female laughter wafted across the wire barrier, igniting something that had long lain dormant within the hearts of the soldiers. Another soldier communicated his shock back home, finding it unbelievable that Americans would allow their women close to enemy troops. Yet he then conceded that it was a deeply affecting experience. The women greeted the officer in charge of the camp, then made their way onto the platform. The soldiers seated on rows of benches stared intently, not fully believing what they were seeing. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, yet also strangely gentle. The conflict, with all its intense brutality, felt suddenly very distant. Something entirely different took its place. The potential of music played not by military personnel, but by ordinary citizens, by women who had deliberately entered enemy territory. The German prisoners realized, perhaps for the first time, that their imprisonment might offer not only survival, but fleeting glimpses of humanity they had never thought possible. The initial notes floated across the camp area, hesitant to begin with, then growing into complete sound. A young woman was seated at an old piano that had been rolled in by the guards. Her fingers moved gracefully over the keys as she performed a well-known classical piece. None other than Beethoven, a composer as German as the men who were listening. The effect was immediate and palpable. A wave of astonishment ran through the assembled crowd. To hear the music of their native land performed with such care by an American woman in the midst of their captivity seemed unbelievable. Some men lowered their heads, overwhelmed with emotion, while others straightened their postures with pride, their spirits lifted by echoes of a culture they feared had been taken from them. Following the classical prelude, the program changed direction. Another woman, holding pages of sheet music, began to sing an American folk song in a bright, clear voice. Though the words were unfamiliar to the prisoners, the tune possessed a universal quality. It was not a march or a military song. It was gentle, almost playful, depicting rural life and hope. Certain prisoners whispered to one another, translating small parts they were able to understand. Others simply closed their eyes, allowing themselves to escape for a brief period from the fences and the guards' ever-watchful presence. The most astonishing moment came when the performers transitioned back and forth between German and American musical traditions. A violinist played a rendition of Schubert's Ave Maria, and the men instinctively stood in respectful silence. It was a hymn that was deeply ingrained in them, and hearing it from the citizens of their captors created a feeling that was both reassuring and unsettling. Then, without a break, the group went into a lively version of Yankee Doodle. The contrast was almost humorous, and nervous laughter rippled through the prisoners. The divide between enemies seemed to disappear for a few brief moments, replaced by a clumsy shared amusement. A few prisoners of war were bold enough to join in. As the women started to hum Silent Night, some voices began to rise from the benches, uncertain at first, but quickly growing stronger. Within moments, hundreds of men were singing in unison, their German words mingling with the English lyrics sung by the visitors. The sound traveled beyond the barbed wire across the fields and into the nearby town. The guards were on edge, showing their unease, yet even they had to recognize the unusual significance of what was happening. The German soldiers were most astounded not by the impressive musical skill on display, but by the reason it was being offered. These women hadn't arrived to make fun of them or to give them a scolding. They were there to share a part of their culture in a totally unexpected setting. The realization that those they were fighting could respect their composers and blend their musical heritage with American tunes left them without words. It was as if the music had created a connection across the enormous divide caused by the war. When the performance concluded, the prisoners stayed where they were, applauding with great energy and expressing their gratitude in broken English. For many, it was the first time since being captured that they felt more like people and less like adversaries. They were still soldiers, still confined, but briefly touched by something bigger than national boundaries. That night, after the lights were turned off in the barracks, the songs played over and over in their thoughts, presenting a new and perplexing view of America, one very different from what they had been told through propaganda. For a long time, the prisoners had only been around men, guards, fellow soldiers, and officers. The sudden presence of women inside the fenced-in area affected them more powerfully than the music itself. These weren't just brief glimpses through the fence or distant figures in a town. These were American women, standing right in front of them, smiling, talking, and laughing as if the lines of prisoners were just another audience. The impact of seeing women was overwhelming. Many prisoners of war had been fighting on the front lines for several years. Some had last seen their wives, fiancés, or girlfriends in quick moments at train stations before going off to war. Others had moved through villages where women were kept separate or quiet under the strict rules of the Nazi regime. And now here, the people holding them captive were allowing women to freely enter a camp filled with enemy soldiers. The effect was quite strong. Hearts raced, conversations quieted to whispers, and everyone's eyes followed the visitors' every move. They watched how they held their music, adjusted their hair, or laughed in between songs. The German soldiers were most amazed by how freely the women acted. In their country, a prisoner camp was a place of strict rules and complete separation. No German woman would ever have been allowed to be around captured enemies, much less show them kindness. The Nazi government made sure of that. However, in America, the women spoke informally and sometimes even spoke directly to the prisoners. One singer stopped to thank the men for listening so attentively, a comment that caused soft murmurs to spread through the rows. Being called gentlemen instead of prisoners or enemies was almost unimaginable. The guards stayed alert with their guns ready, but they didn't get involved in this strange interaction. The Americans seemed to trust that the rules were in place, and were confident that the barbed wire and armed guards were enough to prevent any problems. However, the concept of placing trust was hard for the Germans to understand. They could not see their country allowing such access, where ordinary women were exposed to men who had been their armed enemies just a few months earlier. As one former captive would later recount, a simple action broke down his preconceived notions. A female violinist, at the end of her show, offered a warm smile and wave to the ranks of soldiers. This small, casual wave was incredibly surprising. To him, it marked the instant he understood that the wartime propaganda about America being a land of uncivilized, corrupt people was untrue. These women would not be present, sharing music and goodwill, if America were truly as the Nazi officials had described. Naturally, the emotional impact of these meetings varied among individuals. Overcome with feelings of embarrassment or internal conflict, some prisoners avoided making eye contact with the women. Conversely, others made efforts to remember everything in detail: the color of a dress, the sound of a voice, and how laughter flowed easily without any hesitation. For men living within the tedium of imprisonment, where one day was much like any other, the women's appearance shattered the monotony and brought a feeling of human kindness that no military base activity could offer. The atmosphere within the camp felt altered on that night, once the gates closed. In quiet tones, the prisoners talked, repeatedly recalling the visitors' images. While some smiled as they remembered a comment or action, others found themselves awake, staring at the ceiling, disturbed by the memory of what they had just witnessed. Long after the music ended, the shock remained, serving as a reminder that even in captivity, unexpected moments of significant humanity could arise. In the following days after that initial performance, the atmosphere within the camps began to transform. As the women came back for another performance, the prisoners were no longer sitting silently and stiffly. Instead, an air of quiet anticipation and a hum of conversation could be sensed prior to the start of the music. The soldiers who earlier mocked the notion of cultural activities now leaned forward, waiting for the first notes, curious if there might be another unexpected surprise, perhaps a song they were familiar with. The concert slowly developed into exchanges between the two sides. During one of the visits, the women performed a range of classic American songs like Home on the Range and You Are My Sunshine. These songs spoke of everyday life, a life far removed from the sound of artillery and the destroyed cities. The tunes created images of farms, rivers, and sunny days. For the listening Germans, it offered a glimpse into the America they had only ever envisioned. Following the performance, a group of prisoners of war asked if they could offer a performance as well. While the guards hesitated, permission was eventually granted. The men sang WWII, a song with deep connections to German history, that evening in a shaky, combined voice. Rising from the benches, their voices were unsteady at first, before growing into a moving, strong chorus. The American guests listened quietly, and many were able to recognize the beauty even without understanding the words. When the final note sounded, the women openly showed their appreciation with applause, and the prisoners, caught off guard by the genuine reaction, lowered their heads in acknowledgement. This interaction evolved into a recurring event. On subsequent nights, groups of German soldiers would perform traditional German songs, some melancholic, others vibrant with the spirit of the Rhine or the Black Forest region. The women would respond with well-known American hymns or contemporary songs, fusing the essence of their homeland with the shared space they occupied. Gradually, the concert shifted from being mere performances to becoming a musical dialogue, with each side sharing elements of their respective cultures. For many of the captured men, these communal musical experiences stirred profound personal feelings. Some closed their eyes, envisioning their mothers singing the same tunes in their homes back in Germany. Others were reminded of village celebrations, wedding festivities, or evenings spent in local pubs before the war began. The simple act of singing together softened the harsh realities of being held captive. Men who had fought as adversaries on the battlefield now exchanged musical phrases with American civilians, their voices mingling in the gentle summer breeze. Letters penned later on captured the essence of this unexpected closeness. One prisoner wrote of how the sound of women's voices transported him back to the comforting atmosphere of his own home. Another recounted the exhilaration of hearing applause for a German song, which reaffirmed that their identity had not been obliterated by the conflict. Being seen as individuals with valuable traditions to share was incredibly transformative for men who had been reduced to mere numbers confined behind barbed wire. These instances of cultural exchange did not erase the physical barriers, nor did they diminish the stark reality of captivity. However, they fostered small, delicate yet undeniable connections between people who were supposed to remain adversaries. Each song carried with it a sense of unspoken agreement, one that was deeply personal rather than politically or officially driven, and it lingered in the air long after the music faded into the darkness. Not everyone interpreted these interactions in the same way. Many prisoners regarded the concerts as precious and unexpected gifts, reminding them that life extended beyond the confines of barbed wire and limited rations. However, the American military authorities approached the situation with a degree of wariness. Each performance brought numerous unarmed women into close contact with men who, regardless of their current appearance, had once been the enemy. Commanding officers expressed concerns about maintaining order, wondering whether emotions might escalate or if the presence of women might trigger desperate attempts to break free. Behind closed doors, officers debated the potential risks. Authorizing cultural programs in prisoner of war camps was not a mandate under the Geneva Convention. It was a decision made based on America's belief in its own security and resources. Some commanders suggested that such leniency could undermine military authority or, worse, foster inappropriate relationships that blurred the lines between captor and captive. Yet others emphasized the advantages. Prisoners who felt content were less likely to resist, less prone to plotting, and more likely to cooperate with assigned tasks. They argued that music and morale were powerful tools in their own right. The guards themselves experienced the tension most acutely. During concert performances, they maintained a watchful stance, rifles positioned across their chests, carefully observing every movement within the audience. They were vigilant for lingering gazes, sudden actions, or any sign indicating potential disruption. However, they also recognized an undeniable phenomenon. The men sat in quiet contemplation, displaying a sense of profound respect, as if under a hypnotic influence. On nights featuring female singers, there was a decrease in conflicts, fewer altercations, and significantly reduced agitation within the barracks subsequently. It appeared that the music was achieving something that mere barbed wire could not accomplish. Even among the American population, opinions were not unanimous. Certain adjacent towns expressed full support for the visits, perceiving them as a moral imperative. Religious institutions advocated extending Christian compassion even to adversaries, highlighting the distinction between democratic principles and authoritarian rule. Conversely, some individuals expressed discontent, considering it inappropriate for women to enter enemy territories, and believing that such performances diverted resources that should have been allocated to American soldiers engaged in combat overseas. Letters appeared in local publications, some applauding the initiative, while others denounced it as imprudent or innocent. However, for the detained German soldiers, these discussions held no significance. Their emotions were palpable. The women who entered the camps did not regard them as animals or nameless soldiers. Instead, they treated them as individuals capable of listening, appreciating, and being emotionally affected by music. To experience laughter and applause directed towards them, to witness women smiling at them devoid of fear or animosity, was a revelation that penetrated the unyielding defenses of propaganda they had once embraced. A camp custodian later reflected in his memoirs that he had initially disapproved of the visits. He had deemed them a perilous indulgence, unnecessary during wartime, but after observing the men sitting in captivated silence and witnessing their gentle interactions afterward, he reconsidered his stance. Those concerts, he documented, were the rare instances when they appeared less like captives and more like typical human beings. The military upheld its established protocols. The fences remained tall, and the guards sustained their vigilance. Nevertheless, despite the caution exercised, the concerts persisted. For both factions, the significance of those evenings outweighed the potential hazards, and the music resonated not only across the campgrounds, but also within the memories of all who attended. As time progressed, the concerts evolved beyond mere fleeting entertainment. They transformed into cherished occasions that prisoners carried into their personal thoughts. Each evening following a performance, the barracks were filled with conversations about memories. Men recounted the manner in which a soprano had sustained a high note or how a pianist had smiled while taking a bow. Some whispered about details that might have appeared insignificant, but were magnified by their scarcity. The style of a dress, the brilliance of a brooch, or the fragrance of soap carried by the warm night breeze. Letters penned after these evenings reveal the profound impact of the concerts on the prisoners. Despite the strict censorship of every word, numerous sentiments evaded the black ink of the U.S. Army censors. One soldier recounted in a letter that he experienced kindness from the most unexpected sources, as he described seeing American women singing songs that evoked memories of his childhood. Another soldier, expressing greater caution, wrote to his family that the reality of life in America differed from what they had been led to believe, and hinted at his astonishment at hearing German folk songs receiving applause from an audience of their enemies. Some soldiers provided elaborate accounts of the concerts, filling numerous pages with their detailed recollections. One soldier mentioned the sound of applause reverberating through the barracks, while another described how his fellow soldiers hummed the tunes for several days afterward. Upon reaching German villages, these letters greatly surprised families who had been led to believe that their captured sons and brothers were enduring harsh conditions. For wives and mothers struggling with food scarcity, the notion of their men attending concerts performed by women seemed surreal and almost impossible. However, for the prisoners themselves, the memory of the concerts remained vivid long after the performers had departed. Soldiers who had previously accepted the tedium of captivity now found themselves quietly practicing songs in the evenings, their voices merging softly during rehearsals. Some even established impromptu choirs, preparing to respond to the American singers with polished performances of their own. It was as if the music had shattered the constraints of captivity, allowing light to permeate the monotonous routines of camp life. In their private reflections, many prisoners acknowledged that the presence of women had affected them more profoundly than they were willing to admit. One soldier recalled lying awake at night, envisioning his wife back in Germany, and experiencing a sharp pang of longing intensified by the voices he had heard in the camp. Another confessed in his journal that he was no longer certain of what to believe about the enemy. If American women could treat them with such respect, then perhaps the world was not as straightforward as Nazi propaganda had portrayed it. For some, these memories evolved into a means of survival. The anticipation of the next concert, the chance to hear another song, provided them with something to look forward to in a life otherwise devoid of choice. The memory of a laugh or a melody became a lifeline they clung to during lengthy workdays or in the silence of their sleeping quarters. By the time many of these men were relocated or eventually sent back home, the concerts had become a defining aspect of their time in captivity. These were moments that blurred the distinctions of war and allowed them to feel, even briefly, like they were once again part of the world, rather than prisoners isolated from it. When the war finally concluded and the lengthy repatriation process began, numerous German prisoners carried with them not only memories of their confinement, but also clear recollections of the concerts. They boarded ships heading to Europe carrying their personal belongings. However, what they valued most were the intangible songs that had been sung, the voices they had heard, and the unforgettable image of American women entering a camp of their enemies without fear. Once they were back in Germany, their stories quickly gained traction. Families were prepared for narratives of suffering and mistreatment, yet a considerable number of ex-prisoners of war instead related instances of remarkable kindness shown to them. They told stories of well-organized camps, consistent provision of food, and most notably, evenings filled with musical performances. The surreal nature of hearing German folk songs being applauded by Americans was a detail emphasized by some. Others spoke of their astonishment at seeing women in dresses entering compounds that had previously contained only barbed wire and armed guards. These narratives held considerable importance, primarily because they starkly contrasted with the information disseminated to ordinary Germans during the war. For men returning to cities reduced to ruins, where sustenance was scarce and morale was low, the memories of concerts experienced while in captivity gained profound symbolic significance. One former prisoner of war recounted how he heard Silent Night performed in both English and German at a camp in Texas, and how he realized in that instant that the war would eventually come to an end. Another recounted being addressed as gentlemen, rather than prisoners, by a smiling American woman, an experience that remained with him long after his return to civilian life. Historians later recognized that these kinds of experiences contributed to a subtle but significant alteration in German attitudes following the war. Even though bitterness and struggle were widespread in the immediate aftermath, a number of former prisoners of war privately contrasted their treatment in America with the more severe circumstances endured by prisoners held elsewhere. The recollection of concerts and of music acting as a bridge across enemy lines became integrated into a wider story that helped some to accept defeat and even foster respect for democratic principles. The influence of those performances continued quietly, resurfacing in memoirs and interviews decades later. One-time prisoners, who had previously regarded America as a heartless adversary, recalled evenings when the sound of a violin or a female voice penetrated through the walls of propaganda. Some acknowledged that the experience molded their perspective of the post-war world, softening animosity and paving the way for collaboration as Germany embarked on its reconstruction under Allied guidance. For the Americans, the concerts were often overlooked, absorbed within the broader endeavors of the USO and local community service during the war years. Nevertheless, for the individuals confined behind the wire, those evenings remained etched in their memories. They were not only surprised by the presence of American women, but also by the humanity that these women embodied, a humanity that could not be extinguished by any fence, guard tower, or uniform. Consequently, in the tranquil moments of post-war Germany, as former soldiers recounted their experiences to their children or documented them in their memoirs, the concerts emerged time and again, serving as evidence that even amid a global conflict, enemies could recognize each other, not merely as anonymous adversaries, but as human beings capable of song, kindness, and bridging divides created by war.